Hello again. This is a brief follow-up in regards to some different questions and trends I've noticed on the December topic. Resolved, immigration reform should include a path to citizenship for undocumented immigrants currently living in the United States. And there's a few things in particular that I want to cover in more detail. The first of which is just the idea of plans. Generally speaking, the banning of plans in public forum hurts the pro and helps the con. On this topic, not so much. Pro is benefited by being able to say any path to citizenship would be a reason to vote for us, and all your drawbacks would be reasons to reject a particular plan, but not to reject the idea of citizenship in general. Like I talked about before, some paths to citizenship already exist in the form of military service for undocumented aliens. And in that regard, pro can kind of say that con has to argue against the status quo and has to abolish existing means of undocumented aliens eventually gaining citizenship. So with that, it becomes pretty important for both teams to narrow down what they're actually debating about early on, because otherwise pretty much any reason that con presents is a reason the path to citizenship should be used differently. A common example is actually gender inequality, saying a path to citizenship, as it is currently envisioned by the bill presented and endorsed by Congress and the Obama administration, respectively, would grant citizenship more to male than female undocumented immigrants, simply because it prioritizes work as the kind of jobs that are done by male undocumented immigrants, and not either working from your own home or working in someone else's home, which are jobs that tend to be predominantly taken up by female undocumented immigrants, and therefore this path to citizenship is bad because it isn't equitable for both genders. Trouble is, pro can just say, well, maybe it should include a path to citizenship that would be equitable to both. They're not tied down to a specific plan unless con finds some way to make the debate about that. So be careful with con about unveiling your best offense before pro is committed to what they are defending. As pro, be aware that what you have to defend is not necessarily the exact same plan that is being presented to Congress, which has already been bargained down and watered down to make it more politically palatable. The second thing that's worth going into in more depth is a lot of teams are turning links or turning impacts before the other team has committed to how they feel about that link or that impact, or who actually accesses it. So for instance, let's say that one side says illegal immigration is bad, and the other side hasn't yet committed to whether or not they will increase or decrease illegal immigration. For instance, con could invest a lot of time, effort, and research into proving that more undocumented aliens in the country is harmful, but if pro hasn't said that a path to citizenship would create more, con still has to prove that. Otherwise, pro can argue that, well, this makes more people documented, which mitigates, if not obviates, the harms that con was talking about. So another thing, for instance, there is just, do undocumented aliens help or hurt the economy? And pro might say, well, we think that undocumented aliens are helpful to the economy. And con might say, well, you actually reduce the number of them. And then that can go to a third level of, well, is it their presence or is it the fact that they are undocumented? Does creating documentation on them, does starting a paper trail, does beginning a path to citizenship change that factor, or does it not? So that's three levels that both teams need to be aware of going into the final focus, or the first two could just result in doing work for the other team. So again, a common example of this would be if one side says, oh, but illegal immigration is bad for the economy, and the other side says, well, actually, we think undocumented aliens are helpful to the economy, and the other side says, well, yes, but the reason they're helpful is because they're undocumented and work below minimum wage, and the other side at that point is probably out of speeches and can't make obvious, easy responses to that, but it seems like you've been arguing the other team's case all along, even though there might be reasons that they could easily respond to the other team saying, well, make this permanent underclass pay below minimum wage because that's the only way they're good for the economy, when that's not necessarily the argument either team intended to make originally, but can be twisted if both teams aren't clear on these things going in, and that's one thing that you want to use Crossfire for on this topic. The third thing I want to talk about in particular is framework. And framework on this topic is a little different than framework on a lot of other topics. On most topics, resolutional analysis, framing, whatever you want to call it, is going to be about who gets the middle ground. And the closest thing to a middle ground in this topic is whether a different path to citizenship would be something that can be endorsed. The trouble is, to be a different path to citizenship from the pro has to be endorsing a specific one. Now, pro can't do that for themselves, but con can kind of make them. One thing that con can say on this topic is that public forum topics are meant to be ripped from the headlines. They're meant to be debating current events. The topic is clearly intended to talk about the path to citizenship that there is existing literature on, i.e. the DREAM Act. And other paths to citizenship wouldn't make it through Congress in the first place and shouldn't be in this discussion, because we need to focus on the one that there are headlines about, because that's the one that we can read the news to learn about, and that's how public forum evidence is supposed to be generated as envisioned in 2002. Obviously, this has changed a little bit since then. There are certain topics that kind of fly in the face of this idea of what topics should be about and how evidence should be found and how people should be familiar with the topics. But the idea that we are talking to a citizen judge who is aware of the headlines in the current newspapers probably is an easier sell than someone should be a veteran policy analyst who is aware of all other competing paths to citizenship and the meta-studies done on the relativistic economic ramifications of each of them, which is probably a little bit of a harder sell to a lay judge. So in that case, you're in a situation where you're talking about the difference between what's Pareto optimal and what's an opportunity cost. So to go into a little more detail on that, even if you say this is the path to citizenship we are talking about as con, pro can still say, okay, that might be the optimal one. All you've done is suggested ways to change it. You've shown that our path to citizenship is not optimal. We've shown that a path to citizenship is still good, and that maybe there are ways that we could improve it, and maybe those would be friendly amendments on the law. Showing that it's not optimal, showing that it leaves certain groups out, affects certain groups wrong, is implemented ineffectively, has obvious vulnerabilities to corruption, those arguments are probably not going to be reasons against having a path to citizenship included in immigration reform. Without a path to citizenship, there's very little to include in immigration reform besides simply border security. Given that we've switched to an amnesty model under a conservative administration in 1986, arguing against that is also kind of hard to find solid sources for, especially because the empirics for most of the economic impacts on that have trouble adding up. Generally speaking, the question becomes reform versus security, and again, you can't really counterplan new border security plans in. All you can do is talk about opportunity costs, which is to say, for instance, including a path to citizenship prevents us from doing this better option. And maybe this better option is not a path to citizenship at all. Maybe it undermines other stances that you want your immigration reform to be taking in the first place. Maybe including a path to citizenship precludes some better option for dealing with the immigration crisis. And there are a couple of these that are kind of farther out to the right or to the left that you can talk about, but that are actually competitive with a path to citizenship. And that's important because it can't be competitive in that it shows theirs isn't optimal and yours is slightly better. It has to be competitive in that theirs prevents yours from being able to happen. So that's where that becomes relevant. Lastly, just want to talk about some con strategies in general, because looking at win-loss records, tab data, etc., it seems like pro is definitely having the easier time on this topic, which a lot of people predicted. So there's a couple things that you can do on con. The most common thing seems to be a study which says undocumented immigration costs $6 billion. Will cost $6 billion more if we allow a path to citizenship. The trouble is, this is not over a year, this is over a long time. The study is done by Heritage and taken from numbers by FAIR, the Federation for American Immigration Reform, which is not the world's most credible source. Generally speaking, when you are attacking evidence in a shortened form of debate with 4-minute, 2-minute speeches, it's not so much about the analysis of the evidence, because you don't have time to get into that necessarily. It's before evidence comes repetition, before repetition comes confidence and familiarity with it. If one team has a very good indite on the other team's evidence, but they only read it once, and the other team then repeats that same evidence again, just the number, not even the methodology, in the next 3 speeches, then very often judges, especially lay judges, are going to vote for the one that was repeated more, rather than the one that was specific to indicting it, was more recent, post-dated, accounted for what the other one said, whatever. So just having the better evidence alone isn't a pass to get around the argument. Beyond that, though, repetition, while helpful, doesn't eclipse familiarity with the evidence, confidence with the evidence, knowing why evidence is good or bad, and being able to explain that succinctly to a wide audience of potential judges depends directly on your familiarity with it. Saying, oh, this evidence is bad because the funding for it created a bias behind it, and they took these 3 assumptions into account which haven't been proven by these empirics from these 3 case studies in these states which had large numbers of undocumented immigrants both increase through people moving in and decrease through various ways of obtaining citizenship through marriage or through legal children. That's not going to do it. On the other hand, for evidence as bad as some of these FAIR studies, or some of these CIS studies, simply saying to the judge, your author also claimed that Jews faked the Holocaust to gain sympathy, is probably an effective indict against just about anybody, and that's actually the level of evidence we're talking about here. Those of you in the various institute groups can take a look at some of the files that have been posted there, which talk about that in more detail. Otherwise, it's pretty easy to find for yourself with Google. So, when attacking evidence, keep it basic. Let's see. One other thing that Khan can do on this topic is circle around to the left of the pro. The DREAM Act itself is a fairly moderate proposal. Yes, it is amnesty, but then again, so was Ronald Reagan's policy. What's probably more important is to know that if pro commits to the DREAM Act and commits to it for reasons which all tend to go fairly liberal, tend to go fairly far to the left, and they're making arguments about how these people have rights, they should be able to become citizens too, then Khan can just take a lot of that away from them and say, okay, we agree that people should be citizens, but we disagree there should be this kind of obstacle course to citizenship that should take years and they should have to earn it. We think that you should be able to do this in an easier way than this path to citizenship you are talking about, and then we shouldn't have this 2-tiered system for people who came into this country, help our economy, work in this country, and pay their taxes. These people shouldn't be on a slower path with a bunch of obstacles in the way and a bunch of costs associated with it. And your path to citizenship probably includes conditions, it probably includes fines, it probably includes certain minimum amounts of money contributed to society in one way or another, through work, through taxes, through fines, through whatever. And if the pro team is arguing that this is all about maximizing the number of people in this country who are documented, who are able to be here legally, then Khan can just kind of circle around them to the left and do that. On the other hand, if a team wants to do this, they pretty much need to go second. The good news is that if you are Khan, you're pretty much guaranteed to be able to have your choice of speaking order on this topic, or you're going to a tournament where Khan is automatically assigned second, so either way, you should be okay in that. Whether you choose to go far to the right of someone on a topic about national security, far to the left of someone on a topic about immigration, if you're speaking second, it often benefits you to switch around the order of your first 2 speeches a little bit. A lot of your contentions in your opening speech should pretty much be defense against points you know they're going to make, or turns and arguments that you know that you'll have time to make after that defense, and most of your offense, most of what you're actually advocating, can be developed more in the second speech, because either way, that leaves you with a complete case coming out of the constructive portion of the round. It leaves you playing defense in a way that keeps their rebuttal from being able to shut down what you want to do or co-opt what you want to say, and lets you refocus the debate farther to the right or farther to the left of where you would like it to be. So if you do it that way, like I said, the rebuttal kind of becomes the opening kind of becomes the rebuttal, and the opening speech needs to be a little bit more modular in terms of what the other team says, how you adapt to it. If you do this way, you're probably going to take your prep time speaking second before your opening speech, So both speakers of yours can use it, and neither speaker of theirs can do anything about it, and that's one way to start to even the ground here. The main issue with this topic, again, is that recent evidence tends to favor the pro side. Most of the con team's arguments aren't necessarily evidence-based in terms of they're being produced by credible scholarship. Most of the objections on con side aren't even really founded in the question of does this help or hurt the economy, but more so the economy is the secondary question. The prior question is should or should not these people be here? And the these people shouldn't be here evidence, whether a judge finds it compelling or not, isn't really quantifiable or weighable. It's more of an assertion, and then some think tanks will create economic evidence afterwards to back that up. But again, it's being done to support a pre-existing position, and that kind of shows in the quality of the cards both sides have access to. There's a reason that some of the paid evidence services on this topic have had to resort to fabricating evidence to fill their con briefs, and that's a pretty good sign that there's a disparity there. So again, some of the ways to deal with that are to have opportunity cost instead of what's optimal, to pin pro down into defending the DREAM Act rather than a generic path to citizenship because it's what's in the headlines, and to go second and be able to short circuit and co-opt a lot of pros' offense if they commit themselves too far to the left or too far to the right. Hope that helps. Only a couple more tournaments on this topic. Good luck at them. We'll be back in a week or two discussing the Sahel region of Africa.